One vision of justice is a world where all have full access, rights, and social, political, and economic inclusion. But not all people have access to things like housing, healthcare, education, economic inclusion, legal justice, and political representation. And globally, it's predictable across lines of race, gender, and class who will have access and who won't. Let's start with housing justice. A world where all have access to housing that is safe and healthy, a place to raise children and grandchildren, to build wealth and pass it to future generations. Over the last 100 years, home ownership has been one of the two main ways Americans have built generational wealth. At the end of World War II, U.S. veterans returning home from war needed homes for their new and growing families, and Roosevelt's New Deal allowed the average American to borrow money to buy a home for the first time. Two practices, redlining and race-restrictive deed covenants, locked Americans of color out of home ownership. Federal investigators evaluated 239 cities in the United States for financial risk, marking communities high risk, medium risk, or low risk. While white communities received the highest rating, green, predominantly black and brown communities received the lowest rating, red. They were redlined. As a result, most mortgages went to white communities. Just 10 years earlier, many white property owners sought the quote-unquote protection of race-restrictive deed covenants, which did not allow non-white people to buy homes in white communities. Often, the restrictions applied only to African Americans wishing to buy property or to rent a house or apartment, but other populations might also be banned, such as Asian Americans, Jews, Indigenous peoples, and Latinx folks. For example, a restrictive covenant covering a large neighborhood in Seattle declared that no part of said property hereby conveyed shall ever be used or occupied by any Hebrew or by any person of the Ethiopian, Malay, or Asiatic race, thus banning Jews and anyone of African, Filipino, or Asian ancestry. The exclusionary language varied widely. Some neighborhoods were reserved for the white or Caucasian race. Others enumerated only banned populations. One subdivision near Seattle specified that this property shall not be resold, leased, rented, or occupied except to or by persons of the Aryan race. These covenants, while no longer legally defensible, remain visible in many U.S. home deeds to this day, like the 2018 examples shown on the screen from Austin, Texas. In many cities, these restrictions left communities of color crowded into small neighborhoods. They essentially weren't allowed to move anywhere else. In their work, The Long Shadow of Racial Discrimination, Sood, Spiegel, and Ehrman Sahlberg discuss how race-restrictive deed covenants succeeded in gridlocking people of color with wealth where redlining failed. No matter how much money you had, your class could not protect you from this new form of racism. But for real estate developers, using covenants was a mechanical way to increase the desirability of particular communities and increasing the value of houses sold in that area. Covenants were able to transform predominantly low-income white areas into middle-class enclaves. Together, redlining and race-restrictive deed covenants ensured the majority of homeowners were white. Communities of color were left with one option, renting. Who were they renting from? Whites. While white families were building wealth through home ownership and rent income that would be passed down for generations, communities of color were locked out of home ownership and the possibility of building and passing on generational wealth. But race-restrictive deed covenants aren't a solely American intervention. In Ontario, Canada, subdivisions employed racial covenants to bar a diverse array of ethnic groups, and these covenants were not struck down until 1945. In France, during World War II, under the Vichy regime, in the free zone outside the Nazi-occupied area, many condominiums inserted clauses forbidding selling to Jews. Racial covenants also emerged in natal South Africa during the 1890s as an attempt to prevent indigenous peoples from acquiring properties in more expensive areas, and were commonplace across the country by the 1930s. They were later used as a tool to further the cause of apartheid against the black population. And in Zimbabwe, racial covenants written into most title deeds excluded people of color, including people raised as Asian or black, from purchasing or occupying homes in white areas. These past practices provide vital context with which to understand the persistent global racial patterns in home ownership that we see today, like shown in this study about home ownership in the UK, where white residents are most likely to own their home and black residents are least likely to do so. Or in this famous image showing the economic and housing disparities in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
Similar patterns persist elsewhere, such as in France, where social housing, a term for high-density housing, is used almost exclusively by people of color. Not only are whites least likely to live in social housing, they are also less likely to live in a neighborhood with high percentages of social housing, due to the high levels of racial segregation.
Across the globe, a common pattern plays out. Aboriginal and Indigenous peoples and people of color are least likely to own their home. In Singapore, the Malay is the second largest ethnic group, and Singapore's constitution recognizes the special position of Malays as the indigenous people of Singapore, as well as the government's responsibility to protect, safeguard, support, foster, and promote Malay political, educational, religious, economic, social, and cultural interests, and the Malay language. Yet, Malay people experience ethnic and religious minoritization and barriers to social, educational, and economic inclusion. In this 2018 study, we can see the dramatic racial and ethnic disparities in home ownership in Singapore. Chinese people are 6 times more likely to own their homes, and Indian people are 5 times more likely to own their homes than Malay people. City planning efforts in many urban areas have contributed to racial disparities in housing and health, placing toxic waste dumps, sewage, and electrical plants near communities of color. In fact, in July 2020, the Nature Conservancy stated that race is the most significant predictor of a person living near contaminated air, water, or soil in the United States. In 2016, a study published in Environmental Research Letters found a consistent pattern over a 30-year period of placing hazardous waste facilities in neighborhoods where poor people and people of color live. Neighborhoods where communities of color were growing in number had the best chances of being selected for such hazardous sites. In 1983, the Government Accountability Office found that Black people made up the majority of communities near landfills. Yet the Environmental Protection Agency that is charged with protecting citizens from discrimination has denied 95% of civil rights claims they've received, and has made a formal finding of discrimination only twice in the agency's history. In the 1950s, cities also invested in urban renewal and used federal funds to build new highways. Many cities used such federal funds to eradicate neighborhoods that were homes to communities of color. In Syracuse, New York, for instance, the completion of Highway 81, which ran through the urban center, had the same effect it had in almost all cities that put interstates through their hearts. It decimated a close-knit Black community, and when the displaced residents from the 15th Ward were forced to move to other city neighborhoods, white residents fled. While new highways destroyed communities of color or physically separated them from areas of economic development, they also made long work commutes between white suburbs and workplaces more within reach for white middle-class Americans. Here we see a recent example from Austin, Texas, where a snowstorm caused a 3-day power outage and interruptions in water service. Communities of color, predominantly Black and Latinx communities in East Austin, shown in the image on the left of Highway 35, were without power the entire time, where downtown Austin, which is predominantly white, maintained power the entire time. In 5 listening sessions held after the outage, residents of color shared their frustrations with hearing the city frame these outages as planned rolling blackouts to maintain the stability of the grid, while they were living without water and power, some for 5 days, and seeing empty stadiums and office buildings lit and burning electricity all day and night. Emergency communications were also almost exclusively transmitted in English, leaving many residents who speak Mandarin, Vietnamese, and Spanish without vital information to survive.
A 2019 report found that Britons of color are exposed to air pollution at rates 19 to 29% higher than white Britons, which may contribute to disparities in health outcomes.
Next, let's look at healthcare justice, a healthcare system where all have access to care that helps us stay well, prevent illness, heal from illness and disease quickly, and lead a long and productive life. There's a growing body of evidence of racial disparities in health outcomes as well, some of which can be explained by racial bias in healthcare. This study by Shavers and Brown looked at physicians' application of the specific standard of care for treating common breast cancer diagnoses. Findings showed that white women were most likely to be given the standard of care, and women of color were less likely to be given the standard of care. In this study, Asian women in particular were least likely to be given the standard of care. Treatment differences were associated with an adverse impact on the health outcomes of women of color, more frequent recurrence, shorter time living free of disease, and higher mortality rates. Other studies show a pattern of whites most likely given the standard of care for treatment of chronic and life-threatening illnesses, and people of color less likely to be given the standard of care. This is true even when controlling for income and health insurance status. We can see that race also predicted mortality rates related to COVID-19. In the US, Black and Indigenous Americans experienced the highest death tolls. Similar patterns in public health care and outcomes have emerged globally. Here we see a study of COVID-19 fatality rates in England, where the 2 groups with the highest mortality rates have one thing in common: they're both Black. And we've also seen disparities in access to vaccines. Even when cities plan to distribute vaccines in communities of color, Many distributions have been socially hacked by whites with greater access to internet, personal vehicles, and time off from work, booking up appointments intended for locals, and traveling into communities of color, sometimes hours away or across state lines, to secure vaccines first. Next, let's look at educational justice, a public education system where all have access to growth and challenge, where all can learn the basics, study in fields of our interest, and become prepared for industry-leading work that is valued and well paid. We also know that race is a predictor of access to education. Race is twice as likely as income status to predict school resourcing. Schools with a predominantly white student body are more likely to have books in the classroom, a library, a librarian at least 2 days a week, and access to computers and calculators. Schools with a student body made predominantly of students of color are less likely to have all of these things. Schools with predominantly white student bodies are also more likely to have a high-quality teacher, meaning an experienced instructor teaching in their field of study, while schools serving predominantly students of color are most likely to get a new and an experienced teacher and someone teaching out of their field of expertise. In fact, Black students were the group most likely to be taught by a brand new teacher, and white students were least likely. Multiple studies also show predictable racial patterns in how students are tracked. Indigenous and Black students were most likely of all groups to receive a special education designation. But among all students with EC designations, Black students alone were most likely to be separated from the general student body and instructed in a separate setting. Disparities were more likely where either the student body was predominantly white or the teaching body was predominantly white. And these disparities were less likely to appear where the student body was either racially diverse or the majority of students were students of color and the teaching body was racially representative of students. The predictable differences in tracking also play out when it comes to receiving a designation as gifted. In Canada, for instance, boys were much more likely to be designated gifted and enrolled in gifted programs than girls. But when looking at achievement, girls were much more likely to be high achievers. The study found a low correlation between being designated gifted and student achievement. And something similar played out across lines of race. East Asian and white students were designated gifted at the highest rates, whereas Middle Eastern, Latinx, and Black students were least likely. Again, there was a low correlation between gifted designation and achievement, with the greatest mismatches in both directions playing out on Asian students, perhaps related to the model minority myth. The study found that whiteness and maleness most strongly correlated with receiving a gifted designation, and the only factor that correlated with both gifted designation and high achievement was parental occupation, a marker of historical wealth, past access to education, and current access to employment.
Access to education is also a persisting challenge. In 121 years, the University of São Paulo Polytechnic, which has the country's largest postgraduate center in engineering, has graduated just 7 Black women. This is attributed to the lasting impacts of systemic sexism and racism in both academia and society at large.
Multiple studies also found differences in school discipline. Suspension and expulsion rates were the highest among Indigenous and Black students and lowest among white and Asian students. There were not significant racial differences in the rates of the 3 most common reasons for suspension: alcohol use, vandalism, and bringing a gun to school. Interestingly, the reasons why Black and white youth were referred for discipline were very different, with Black students being sent to the office for more subjective reasons like disrespect or perceived threat, while white students were more likely to be referred for more objective reasons that included smoking, vandalism, and leaving school without permission. The results of the study led the authors to conclude that racial differences in youth rates of suspension are due in large part to disproportionate office referrals for matters where the teacher has discretion to determine the level of punishment. And when we take an intersectional approach, we see that Black girls in particular are suspended at the highest rates, a phenomenon attributed to the adultification of young Black girls. Next, let's look at legal justice, a system where all are held to a consistently high bar of expectations, where all have mutual responsibilities to our fellow citizens and freedoms in return, where we are all treated consistently and fairly under the law, and where all can seek recourse from harm. When it comes to the criminal justice system, we see over and over that people of color experience greater monitoring and surveilling by police, are more likely searched, charged, and sentenced, and receive more harsh sentencing, even for the same infractions. In this example, similar crimes committed by similar aged men with similar records received very different sentences from the exact same judge. Now let's take a look at racial patterns in justice in the UK. If you are male and black, you are 2.7 times more likely to be arrested than if you are white. You are 1.2 times more likely to have a criminal case brought against you. You're 1.2 times more likely to get a custodial sentence. And you're 1.4 times more likely to be placed in a high security prison. To be clear, we are talking about the treatment of children ages 10 to 17. Next, let's look at economic justice, a financial system where all can participate, a market that values all of our labor and pays us a living wage, a market where all can borrow money, be invested in, and invest in others.
Racial income disparities exist nearly everywhere they're measured. We can see here that white immigrants in the UK consistently earn more than people of color who are either British-born or immigrants. And in Malaysia, the Malay people, or those indigenous to Malaysia, consistently earn less than the overall population and earn significantly less than the Chinese. And we can see here that in Malaysia, the disparities between indigenous and Chinese households are growing.
There are also patterns in who is invested in and who is not. Male founders of companies are most likely to have their companies funded by venture capital funders. Women are less likely. Although 40% of privately held companies are founded by women, they only receive 2% of venture capital funding. The gender disparities in venture capital funding has remained static since 2012. People of color, women of color in particular, are least likely to have their companies funded. In 2018, the median funding raised by all Black women founders was $0, and people of color might paradoxically encounter more obstacles after they have proved themselves to be strong performers. A 2019 study showed that when venture capital funds are managed by a person of color with strong credentials, professional investors judge them more harshly than their white counterparts with identical credentials. It's not simply a pipeline problem, co-author Eberhardt said. African Americans who are most qualified, those with the best track record, are getting blocked the most. Finally, let's look at political representation. We all have political representatives that represent us, that understand us, our backgrounds, experiences, our assets, goals, and challenges. When it comes to political representation, some of us have enjoyed a lifetime of political representatives who understand us, our backgrounds, assets, needs, and goals. For myself, as a white man, every political representative I have ever had at the local, state, or national level has had something in common with me: my gender, race, or class background. But some, women, people of color, and women of color in particular, have gone a lifetime without ever having a political representative who shares their background and understands their experiences, challenges, assets, needs, and goals.